And then probably half the people here are here because of a wonderful thing. Besides Mentor Graphics Corporation supporting the series, Mentor Graphics Foundation supported this program to allow us to bring all the K-12 people, the teachers, and so we, it turns out that the guy I'm about to introduce is one of the main players in the foundation's decision making, so I just wanted, okay, can we have a roar from all the people saying thank you to the foundation? That's sort of subtle lobbying. This is Greg Hinckley, who's the president of Mentor Graphics Corporation.
Thank you, Terry. Looks like tonight, like so many times, I'm mic handicapped. They set the mics up for people who are certainly under 6 feet in height, and I'm 6'7", so bear with me. It's a great pleasure to sponsor this series of lectures. The people at Mentor Graphics are truly lucky. We get to work in an environment that we love. Most of us are either engineers, physicists, mathematicians, and we'd like to extend and encourage the future scientists of tomorrow to understand what all this means and share our love for the discipline. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Freeman J. Dyson, Professor Emeritus at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. This is an institution that is famous for such noted thinkers as Albert Einstein, John von Neumann, and John Nash. Dr. Dyson is degreed from Cambridge University and Cornell University. He's a winner of many awards, including the Danny Heinemann Prize by the American Institute of Physics, the Lorentz Medal of the Royal Netherlands Academy, the Hughes Medal of the Royal Society in London, the Britannica Medal, the Matteucci Medal, and the Ornstead Medal. He's a member of the National Academy of Science, a Fellow of the Royal Society, Honorary Fellow of Trinity College, and Associé étranger de l'Académie des Sciences. Dr. Dyson is a mathematician and physicist and did important and original work in quantum electrodynamics and statistical physics. He's a noted author, as we all saw in the entrance of the Schnitzer, with works including Disturbing the Universe, Weapons and Hope, Origins of Life, Infinite in All Directions, and importantly, as we'll see tonight, Dr. Dyson is a champion in the social, political, and ethical realms on the good for all mankind that science can and must do. His lecture tonight is titled Technology and Social Justice, and as was said in the New York Times book review, Dr. Dyson puzzles over the meaning of life, the purpose of the universe, and the nature of God. In short, he is a philosopher in the broadest sense. Please welcome Dr. Freeman Dyson.
Well, thanks very much.
Dr. Dyson.
Well, thank you for that, and thanks for everybody who had a hand in inviting me here. I'm very happy to be in Linus Pauling's hometown. Excuse me for reading the talk. I don't want to drivel on and on as I would if I tried to do it extemporaneously. It's all right to talk extemporaneously if you really know the subject, but not otherwise. So I'll be trying to answer two questions. First, can we pursue high-tech science and technology without widening the gap between rich and poor? And second, is there a practical way to combine technological progress with social justice as we move into the future? Those are the crucial questions that have to be answered if we want the public to believe that science and technology have anything to do with social justice. At present, our society is polarized into two communities: a community of technophiles who believe in the pursuit of high technology as an end in itself without much regard for social justice, and a community of humanitarians who believe in the pursuit of social justice as an end in itself without much regard for science. There's not much overlap between the two communities, but I happen to belong to both, and that's why I ask these questions. I hold it to be ethically unacceptable to tolerate the gross inequalities that prevail in the world today between rich and poor countries and between rich and poor citizens of individual countries. And I hold it to be intellectually unacceptable to abandon the pursuit of scientific knowledge and the technological power that scientific knowledge inevitably brings with it. Both our ethical and our intellectual ideals must be sustained if we are to fulfill our obligations as stewards of a vulnerable planet. So we have to confront the question whether the demands of ethics and the demands of intellectual freedom are compatible. I don't find it fruitful to discuss these questions in the abstract, arguing from general principles. We're dealing with human problems that can best be understood by examining particular cases. So I'll look at a series of case histories illustrating the many ways in which well-meaning attempts to improve the human condition with technology can fail. And I'll also look at cases in which technology aimed at social improvement succeeded. At the end, I'll try to deduce some lessons from the failures and successes. If we can understand what went wrong and what went right, we might have a better chance of avoiding failures and achieving successes. So I'll start on story number one, which is called Kongwa. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, nobody's heard of Kongwa. 55 years ago in England, Kongwa was in the news every day. Kongwa is a small town in Tanzania, then the British colony of Tanganyika, 6 degrees south of the equator, 3,000 feet above sea level, in the central highlands of Tanzania. In 1945, it was chosen as one of the main sites of the African groundnut scheme. The groundnut scheme was a grandiose project for growing groundnuts, known to Americans as peanuts, on virgin lands in East Africa. The scheme was launched at the end of World War II with great fanfare and great hopes. 4 historical factors combined to make the scheme attractive to colonial administrators in Africa and to the public in Britain. First, the impending demobilization of large numbers of African soldiers who had helped to defeat the Italian and German armies in Africa. Those soldiers had become expert in handling machinery of all kinds, and they needed opportunities to put their skills to work in the civilian economies of their homelands. Second, the existence of great quantities of surplus earth-moving equipment that had been used in the African campaigns to build roads and airfields and was now lying derelict on the old battlefields. Third, the need for a high-protein staple crop that would help to feed the rapidly growing populations of East Africa. And fourth, the existence of large areas of scrub jungle left untouched by the white settlers who had appropriated most of the good agricultural land for their own farms. The politicians in London and the soldiers in Africa shared a dream. They dreamed that the skills acquired by the Africans in 6 years of war could be put to better use in the pursuits of peace, to create a prosperous economy in East Africa based on mechanized agriculture. Given large areas of land with the machines to make it productive and the skills to operate the machines, the dream was that the Africans could build a modern economy independent of the white settlers. This was a seductive dream, especially to the Attlee government that came to power in Britain in 1945 after defeating Winston Churchill. The Attlee government freed India and intended to dismantle what was left of the British Empire. It was a socialist government. In the year 1945, when the groundnut scheme was launched, socialism was riding high. The wartime economy of Britain had been effectively socialistic and had functioned well. The white settlers in India and in Africa were symbols of a discredited and oppressive capitalism. The transfer of power in the territories of the empire would be a transfer from the old capitalist regime of the white settlers to new socialist regimes of native Indians and native Africans. The architects of the groundnut scheme saw themselves as natural allies of the new generation of African leaders, united in their contempt for the white settlers and in their hope for a glorious socialist future. As the years went by, news from the front lines of the groundnut campaign trickled back to England, and the news was not good. It took a long time to organize the transport of surplus war equipment to East Africa and to build adequate roads to the areas where it was to be used. Much of the equipment, when it finally arrived, was found to be unusable. After the work of land clearing began, it turned out that tree stumps were unexpectedly resistant to mechanical digging. Many of the stumps had to be shattered with high explosives and excavated by hand. The progress of stump clearing was so slow that only 1/10 of the area intended for agriculture was ever cleared. After the decision was made to go ahead with the planting of groundnuts on the reduced area, the final disaster struck. The removal of the natural vegetation made the underlying soil unfit for any sort of agriculture. A single season of exposure to the tropical sun converted the soil into laterite, a hard material resembling baked clay or brick. After the soil was baked, it could not be plowed and groundnuts could not be planted. So in the end, the total harvest of groundnuts was less than 1/100th of the quantity predicted by the planners. The scheme was quietly abandoned and the soldiers went home to their villages, leaving nothing behind but rusting machines and patches of baked red clay which had once been forests. After the collapse of the project, the government set up a commission of inquiry to investigate the causes of failure. Many mistakes were identified, 2 of which were fatal. First, the decision to launch the project was made by people ignorant of the ecology of East Africa. Any competent expert in tropical forestry or any local farmer familiar with the region could have predicted the failure. The second fatal mistake was the failure of the organizers to listen to the bad news when it came. From beginning to end of the project, there were plenty of reports that things were not going well, plenty of opportunities for changing direction or cutting losses. But the leaders of the project would not listen because for them failure was unthinkable. That generation of politicians and soldiers had learned far too well the lessons of World War II. After all, we have beaten Hitler, they said, and we can beat the African jungle too. They failed to understand that the African jungle was a more sophisticated enemy than Hitler. Besides the mistakes that the Government Commission of Inquiry identified, there was a third mistake that the Commission did not include within its terms of reference. The third mistake was philosophical rather than technical. The philosophy of the organizers was enlightened despotism. They knew what was good for the Africans, and they intended to give the Africans what was good for them. They didn't ask whether, even if the project had been technically successful, the majority of Africans would have considered it good. Would the conversion of large areas of virgin jungle to mechanized agriculture have done more good than harm in the long run to the local African economies? The answer to this question was not obvious, and the only people who could have answered it authoritatively were the Africans. And since the project failed, we shall never know what their answers would have been. Almost 200 years earlier, Benjamin Franklin gave a clear answer to the same question. His answer was negative. Franklin was at that time, for the last 10 years before the outbreak of the American Revolution, living in London as an agent of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for commercial and political dealings with the British authorities. He was an active member of the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in London, as well as the American Philosophical Society, which he had helped to found in Philadelphia. I'm proud to say I'm a member of both those societies too. They're both still going strong and doing good works. The London Society encouraged inventions and manufactures by offering financial subsidies and prizes to inventors and entrepreneurs. The prizes were usually available to all subjects of the king, either in England or America, but they were often targeted to subsidize colonial enterprises that the society considered desirable. When Franklin first joined the London Society in 1755, he was an enthusiastic supporter of its efforts to encourage invention. He saw that as complementary to the efforts of his own philosophical society in America. But as the years went by and the relations between the colonies and Britain deteriorated, his attitude to the London Society became more critical. He never openly disagreed with the society, and he actually remained a member after leaving London to fight for American independence. He was a member in good standing all through the War of Independence and afterwards until his death. But he recorded privately in the margin of a book his true feelings about the system of prizes and subsidies offered by the society. So I quote now from Benjamin Franklin: "What you call bounties given by Parliament and the society are nothing more than inducements offered to us to induce us to leave employments that are more profitable and engage as such as would be less so without your bounty, to quit a business profitable to ourselves and engage in one as shall be profitable to you. That is the true spirit of all your bounties." Franklin wrote those words in 1770, 6 years before the outbreak of the war that ended the British Empire in America. The same words might have been written by a thoughtful African businessman in Kenya or Tanzania, contemplating the possible consequences of the groundnut scheme, if the scheme had been carried through according to plan, a few years before the end of the British Empire in Africa. Well, that's a long story, but the others will be a bit shorter. So, more failures. After the groundnuts fiasco, my next example of good intentions gone astray is the Great Leap Forward in China, begun by Mao Zedong in 1958 and ended in 1961. This was a tragedy on a scale enormously greater than the groundnut scheme, resulting in millions of deaths as well as impoverishment of the Chinese population. After the disaster was over, no commission of inquiry gave a public accounting of the history of the project or of the magnitude of the losses. Many details of the story are still held secret. We still do not know precisely what Mao hoped to achieve and why he failed. One of his primary aims was to use technology to cause a massive transfer of wealth and power from the cities of China to the villages. He decreed that villages all over China should be organized into production brigades, producing industrial goods such as steel in addition to their traditional agricultural output. The plan was administered in such a draconian style that agricultural output fell sharply, while the industrial output was of such poor quality as to be almost useless. Like the leaders of the groundnut scheme, Mao saw only the political advantages of the Great Leap Forward and did not see the technical difficulties. He loved peasants and he disliked city dwellers, just as the British socialist politicians loved the native Africans and disliked the white settlers. Like the British politicians, Mao knew what was good for the peasants and gave it to them whether they liked it or not. He knew very little about the details of industrial production. He neglected to consult the experts who could have told him what kinds of industrial output a Chinese village could produce and what kinds it could not produce. He imagined that the villages could create a new industrial economy in a single year, but he did not imagine the depth of the disruption that such a leap forward would cause to their normal agricultural activities. And so, millions of peasants died, victims of his love. I don't need to dwell further on the Great Leap Forward and the other disasters that socialist ideology, allied with technical incompetence, inflicted on the suffering millions of Russia and China. Nobody today is seriously advocating another Great Leap Forward as a way to bring prosperity to the poor. The next story is about a failed attempt to use modern technology to help the poor in the United States by providing them with affordable housing. This happened during the administration of President Carter. Carter has always been trying to provide decent housing for poor families. As ex-president, he has played a leading role in the Habitat for Humanity movement, which organizes the building of affordable housing by the people who need it. Habitat for Humanity works well, but it has nothing to do with high technology. It uses conventional materials and conventional construction methods. But when Carter was president, he asked the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to explore the possibilities for using high-tech methods and high-tech materials to bring down the costs of housing. HUD asked a group of scientists called Jason to see what could be done. I happened to be a member of Jason, so I took part in the study. We educated ourselves for several weeks, listening to experts from the construction industry and visiting construction sites. Then we sat down and tried to invent better ways of building houses. We found many ways to reduce costs without sacrificing quality, mostly by integrating the various components of the structure for quicker assembly. The most effective way of reducing costs is to do as much as possible of the assembly in the factories and as little as possible on site. The use of high-tech materials has a much smaller effect in reducing costs. After we had finished inventing, we wrote a report summarizing our conclusions. Then we discovered, to our dismay, that almost all our suggestions had been adopted long before by the mobile home industry. The final result of our weeks of study was that we had reinvented the mobile home. If you want cheap housing, mobile homes are technically the best solution. But for social and institutional reasons, mobile homes are unsatisfactory. They do not mix well with conventional homes and are therefore confined to trailer parks. And the trailer park widens the gap between rich and poor instead of bridging it. After we understood this, we reported to HUD that we had found no satisfactory technical solution to the problem of affordable housing. The solution to the problem, as Jimmy Carter has demonstrated, comes from human solidarity and not from science. So, the fourth story, solar energy. The stories I've told up to now have been ancient history. It's time now to look at some recent stories that relate more directly to our present concerns. I'll talk next about a project called Solar Electric Light Fund, or SELF for short. This is a private foundation based in Washington, run by a young man called Bob Freeling. The project is still growing, and we don't yet know whether it'll be a success or a failure. It is certainly a success in the places where it's operating, in 14 different countries. It's operating in villages in remote regions far from electric power grids in western China, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Nigeria, Nepal, Bhutan, Solomon Islands, South Africa, Uganda, Vietnam, Brazil, and Afghanistan. Villages in several more countries will soon be added to the list. That's the good news. The bad news is that the project is not autocatalytic. Although it is operating well in each individual village, it does not spread spontaneously from one village to the next. If to be successful means to make a major contribution to the welfare of a country, then self is not yet a success. To make a major contribution, it must learn to spread from one village to another like an infectious virus. The business plan of self is to supply villages with solar panels that generate electricity from sunlight. Panels are installed on individual homes together with storage batteries and switches so that electricity generated in the daytime can be used at night. There's no need for an electric distribution system. Each home is supplied independently. In a typical system, each home receives 50 watts, enough to operate a couple of fluorescent lights, a radio and a radio telephone, and perhaps a black and white television. The capital cost of the system is about $500 per home. The panels are not cheap. They're standard commercial products, engineered to operate reliably for many years in all kinds of weather. Before they're supplied to a village, the villagers must sign a contract to pay for the panels at market prices. Self gives credit to the villagers so that the payment can be spread out over 4 years. Self also gives the villagers training so they can maintain and repair the equipment. In the regions where Self operates, the standard fuel is usually kerosene, which is expensive because it has to be hauled for large distances over bad roads. Or in case of Solomon Islands, it has to be hauled in canoes. The electricity supplied by Self replaces kerosene so that the solar equipment pays for itself in about 4 years by saving the money that would otherwise have been spent on kerosene. After the 4-year period of repayment of the loan to Self, the village has a free supply of electricity. In the villages where Self is operating, there is a substantial improvement in the quality of life. The most important change is the easy communication by radio telephone with the outside world. The village is no longer isolated, but is part of a wider community. Electric light in the homes allows children more time for study and homework, so they do better in school. Adults are also able to work more at night, either educating themselves or making things to use or sell. But Bob Freeling, the moving spirit of Self, feels strongly that these local improvements are not enough. Much more needs to be done if Self is to fulfill its promise. Freeling is not a technical expert, but a linguist. He is fluent in many languages, and he takes the trouble to understand the local cultures of the people he's dealing with. He is more interested in the human aspects of Self than in the technology. He knows that humans need larger visions to inspire them if they're to break out of the traditional routines that hold them down and keep them poor. 50 watts of light and a telephone are not enough. So a few years ago, Self started a new venture at Mieka Secondary School, a rural public high school in a district of South Africa without access to electric power or telephones. Enough solar collectors were installed to run 20 computers, an overhead projector, a satellite link to the internet, and a lot of auxiliary equipment, so that the Mieka children can use the computers and receive the same kind of education as the children in the wealthy suburbs of Durban or Johannesburg. The effect on the children and on the local communities has been dramatic. The children become employable in the modern economy of South Africa and can hope to find high-paying jobs. Meluse Swane, the local principal, is working hard to ensure that the children and the teachers make good use of their equipment. Swane is also blowing his trumpet, advertising the achievements of his school to the South African government and to the world community of education. As a result of his efforts inside and outside the school, Meka was chosen as the grand prize winner in a contest organized by the International Solar Energy Society. 2 Meka children who wrote prize-winning essays were invited with the principal of the school to speak and exhibit drawings of the school at an international solar energy meeting in Mexico City in September. You can see some of their drawings in a booklet published by the International Solar Energy Society. Meka is now famous and is becoming a role model for thousands of schools without access to electricity in South Africa and around the world. This is a very different model for SELF to follow compared with the small-scale provision of electric light to village homes. The Meka model needs kilowatts of electricity instead of watts, big inputs of money instead of small loans, big publicity and fanfare instead of quiet obscurity. Freeling welcomes the change in style. He believes the Meka model is the way to make a major impact on the problems of rural poverty. As he says, big foundations and governments with billions to spend are not interested in electric light, but they're always interested in education. Big foundations find it much more exciting to put solar energy into schools than to put it into homes. So it might happen that with the help of the big foundations, the Meka model could become autocatalytic. SELF now has similar projects underway in Nigeria and in Brazil, and in 2 other villages in South Africa. Every school achieving a success like Meka could stimulate 10 others to raise the money to follow the same model. The big foundations have enough billions to equip them all if enough competent teachers and principals can be found to staff them. Freeling imagines that the 16,000 rural schools of South Africa, which now have no electricity, could follow the Meka model, bringing high-quality education to every corner of the country, opening opportunities to every child in every village to share in the growth and the wealth of a modern economy. That's a grand dream which may or may not come true, but without grand dreams, the poor of the world will not be much helped. Freeling knows that SELF must have a grand dream if it is to move the world. The dream of good schooling for every child is a good place to start. So next story, microcredit banking. At the same time, while SELF has been slowly evolving, a much larger and better known project has been dramatically succeeding, namely the Grameen Bank. You've all probably heard of the Grameen Bank, an enterprise started by Mohammed Yunus, a professor of economics at the University of Chittagong in Bangladesh. To my mind, the most amazing thing about the Grameen Bank is that it was started by a professor of economics. Professors of economics are the last people I would expect to do something sensible in the real world. Yunus had been teaching economic theory to middle-class students at the university, while people in villages all around were dying of starvation in a terrible famine. One day he decided that everything he was teaching was irrelevant to the real needs of his people, so he walked out of the classroom and visited the villagers in their homes. He quickly discovered that he could make a big difference in the lives of the villagers by lending them very small amounts of cash. He began in the village of Jobra by lending a total amount equivalent to 27 United States dollars out of his own pocket. The money went to skilled workers who needed only tiny amounts of capital to buy tools and start small enterprises. They used the money well and paid back the loans. And that was the beginning of the Grameen Bank. It was autocatalytic from the beginning and grew explosively. Now, 25 years later, Yunus finds himself running a $1 billion operation with over 2 million borrowers. It has grown far beyond his wildest dreams. repayment rates have remained consistently above 96%. Yunus has become the leader of a world movement called microcredit banking. The basic idea of microcredit banking is that you can deal with poverty far more cost-effectively from the bottom up than from the top down. If you work from the bottom up, every dollar that you lend goes directly to help a poor citizen become self-supporting. If you work from the top down, as most banks and international aid agencies are accustomed to do, a large fraction of your dollars go to bureaucrats and middlemen, and only a small fraction trickles down to the poor. Yunus says that his success results mainly from following two simple rules. First, lend to women rather than to men. Second, lend to women in groups of 5 and give additional credit to the group only when all 5 members are repaying what they borrowed. The first rule eliminates most of the drones and parasites from the system. The second rule ensures that each borrower is subject to the discipline imposed by her group. Up to this point, the Grameen Bank had nothing to do with high technology. Yunus succeeded because he understands human nature, not because he understands technology. But he has recently added an important technical component to the bank's activities in Bangladesh. The bank lends money to women to buy cellular telephones which provide commercial telephone service to a village. The villagers pay by the minute for use of the telephone, and the owners of the telephone make enough profit to pay back the loan and feed their families. In this way, the bank is helping to bring the villagers into the modern world, as well as helping the villagers to escape from poverty. After the spectacular success of Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, many other countries have tried to copy it with mixed results. The model generally works better in poor countries than in rich ones. The main difficulty is to find a large staff of full-time professionals living in the communities that they serve to administer the local operations of the bank. The professional managers must be educated, honest, impartial, and dedicated to their work, and they must be paid enough to keep them happy. Such people are easy to find in Bangladesh because there's a big class of educated unemployed to draw from, and the customary wages of clerical workers are very low. In the United States, such people are hard to find, even in poor neighborhoods, and a bank specializing in small loans cannot afford to pay them competitive wages. The Grameen Bank works well in Malaysia and Bolivia, poorly in the United States. Because of the difficulties of staffing, it's easier to help poor people to help themselves in poor countries than in rich countries. Bangladesh was a good place to start, with a poor but literate population, heirs to an ancient civilization. Story number 7, green and gray technology. Rural poverty is one of the great evils of the modern world. The lack of jobs and economic opportunities in villages drives millions of people to migrate from villages into overcrowded cities. The continuing migration causes immense social and environmental problems in the major cities of poor countries. The effects of the poverty are most visible in the cities, but the causes of the poverty lie mostly in the villages. That's why the Grameen Bank is uniquely important. It's the only institution that directly attacks the problem of rural poverty by creating wealth and jobs in the villages. It succeeded where Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward failed. It gives the villagers an economic alternative to migration. It gives them a chance to survive and prosper without uprooting themselves. This shifting balance of wealth and population between villages and cities is one of the main themes of human history over the last 10,000 years. The shift from villages to cities is strongly coupled with a shift from one kind of technology to another. I find it convenient to call the two kinds of technology green and gray. The adjective green has been appropriated and abused by various political movements, particularly in Europe, so I need to explain clearly what I have in mind when I speak of green and gray. Green technology is based on biology, gray technology on physics and chemistry. Roughly speaking, green technology is the technology that gave birth to village communities 10,000 years ago, starting from the domestication of plants and animals, the invention of agriculture, the breeding of goats and sheep and cows and pigs, the manufacture of textiles and cheese and wine. Gray technology is the technology that gave birth to cities and empires 5,000 years later, starting from the forging of bronze and iron, the invention of wheeled vehicles and paved roads, the building of ships and war chariots, the manufacture of swords and guns and bombs. For the first 5 of the 10,000 years, wealth and power belonged to villages with green technology, and for the second 5,000 years, wealth and power belonged to cities with gray technology. Beginning about 500 years ago, gray technology became increasingly dominant as we learned to build machines using power from winds and water and steam and electricity. In the last 100 years, wealth and power were even more heavily concentrated in cities as gray technology raced ahead. As cities became richer, rural poverty deepened. This sketch of the last 10,000 years of human history puts the problem of rural poverty into a new perspective. If rural poverty is a consequence of the unbalanced growth of gray technology, it's possible that a shift in the balance back from gray to green might cause rural poverty to disappear. That's my dream. During the last 50 years, we've seen explosive progress in the scientific understanding of the basic processes of life. And in the last 20 years, this new understanding has given rise to an explosive growth of green technology. The new green technology allows us to breed new varieties of animals and plants, as our ancestors did 10,000 years ago, but now 100 times faster, taking a decade instead of a millennium to create a new crop plant. Guided by a precise understanding of genes and genomes, instead of by trial and error, we can within a few years modify plants so as to give them improved yield, improved nutritive value, or improved resistance to pests and diseases. Within a few more decades, as the continued exploration of genomes gives us more complete knowledge of the architecture of living creatures, we shall be able to design new species of microbes and plants according to our needs. The way will then be open for green technology to do more cheaply and more cleanly many of the things that gray technology can do, and also to do many things that gray technology has failed to do. Green technology could replace most of our existing chemical industries and a large part of our mining and manufacturing industries. Green technology could achieve a more complete recycling of waste products and worn-out machines with great benefit to the environment. An economic system based on green technology could come much closer to the goal of sustainability, using sunlight instead of fossil fuels as the primary source of energy. New species of termite could be engineered to chew up derelict automobiles instead of houses, and new species of tree could be engineered to convert carbon dioxide and sunlight into liquid fuels instead of cellulose. But before genetically modified termites and trees can be allowed to help solve our economic and environmental problems, great arguments will rage over the possible damage they may do. Many of the people who call themselves green are passionately opposed to green technology. But in the end, if the technology is developed carefully and deployed with sensitivity to human feelings, it's likely to be accepted by most of the people who will be affected by it, just as the equally unnatural and unfamiliar green technologies of milking cows and plowing soils and fermenting grapes were accepted by our ancestors long ago. But what has this dream of a resurgent green technology to do with the problem of rural poverty? In the past, green technology has always been rural, based in farms and villages rather than in cities. In the future, it will pervade cities as well as countryside, factories as well as forests. It won't be entirely rural, but it will still have a large rural component. After all, the cloning of Dolly occurred in a rural animal breeding station in Scotland, not in an urban laboratory in Silicon Valley. Green technology will use land and sunlight as its primary sources of raw materials and energy. Land and sunlight cannot be concentrated in cities. They are spread more or less evenly over our planet. When industries and technologies are based on land and sunlight, they will bring employment and wealth to rural populations. It's lucky that sunlight is most abundant in tropical countries where a large fraction of the world's people live and where rural poverty is most acute. Since sunlight is distributed more equitably than coal and oil, green technology can be a great equalizer, helping to narrow the gap between rich and poor countries. I recently published a book with the title, The Sun, the Genome, and the Internet. Excuse me, this is a commercial. Describing a vision of green technology enriching villages all over the world and halting the migration from villages to megacities. The three components of the vision are all essential. The sun to provide energy where it's needed, the genome to provide plants which can convert sunlight into chemical fuels cheaply and efficiently, the internet to end the intellectual and economic isolation of rural populations. With all three components in place, every village in Africa could enjoy its fair share of the blessings of civilization. People who prefer to live in cities would still be free to move from villages to cities, but they would not be compelled to move by economic necessity. So story number 8, the World Economic Forum. My last story will be a short one. In January 2001, 2 years ago, my wife and I were lucky enough to be invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Davos was wonderful, an amazing collection of bright people of all kinds, old and young, not only business leaders, but artists and writers and musicians and scientists and politicians gathered from all over the world. The formal sessions were brief. For most of the time, we were free to walk and talk and get to know one another as we chose. The most impressive person that we met by chance when we shared a table with her at lunch at a ski lodge high on the mountain above Davos. She is a 30-year-old German lady, Sabriya Tenberken, who runs a school for blind children in Tibet. She is herself totally blind, but became an expert on Asian languages when she was a student in Bonn. She became especially interested in Tibetan literature, and in order to study it, she had to invent for her own convenience a system of Braille transliteration adapted to the Tibetan script. The Tibetan script was borrowed from India and not from China. It's syllabic and not ideographic, so the characters can be efficiently transliterated into the 63 characters of Braille. Using an optical scanning system hooked up to a Braille printer with her own software, she was able to transcribe the documents in the library in Bonn into Braille so she could read them conveniently. She continued her study of the ancient manuscripts, wrote her thesis, and got her PhD. And she'd intended to continue her life as a scholar of Oriental languages, but meanwhile, somebody in Tibet heard what she had done and invited her to come to Tibet to explain her system. When she arrived in Tibet, she discovered that Tibet has the highest incidence of blindness of any country in the world. Large numbers of children are blind because of the strong ultraviolet radiation from the high-altitude sun, the dusty, dry winds, the generally unhealthy conditions, and the lack of competent doctors. And the children don't wear sunglasses. Many blind children are hidden by their families, never go to school, and have no chance to do anything with their lives except to beg on the streets. So Sabriya went to the Tibetan authorities and said, I intend to stay here and teach these children to read and write. It took a while to persuade the authorities that she meant what she said, but she persisted. She started her school, and it is now flourishing. The children don't stay long in her school. She teaches them intensive reading and writing, elementary mathematics and geography, and after 6 months or 1 year, they are mainstreamed. They're transferred to ordinary schools where they mix with sighted children while continuing to read and write in Braille. This gives them a chance to lead normal lives in Tibetan society. Sabriya has now been in Tibet for 4 years and plans to stay at most 1 more year, by which time she will have trained enough Tibetan teachers to run her school without her. In fact, she's already started 4 or 5 more schools in Tibet run by Tibetans. She has founded an organization called Braille Without Borders and is planning to start schools for blind children in other remote places where the need is greatest. One of the places where she's already operating is in Ye, in the extreme north of India, where they have also a Tibetan population with a high incidence of blindness. And there they can use the same Tibetan Braille system that they use in Tibet. The theme of the meeting in Davos was globalization with a human face. The big business tycoons and the politicians were struggling with the question how to enable the poorer half of the world to share the benefits of high technology and the global marketplace. There was much talk of Africa and AIDS. 4 heads of state were there, from Senegal, Nigeria, Tanzania, and the Republic of South Africa. Bill Gates came with a gift of $100 million for development and testing of AIDS vaccines. Everyone was agreed that globalization by itself is not the answer to Africa's problems. Somehow globalization has to be combined with local initiatives that are responsive to local traditions and local needs. Nobody offered us a clear picture of how this should be done. While I was listening to those big shots talk, I was thinking, while you big shots are failing in your efforts to use modern technology to help the poor, this young woman, Sabriya Tenberken, has found a way to do it. So it's time now to summarize what we might have learned from the stories that I told you. I asked 2 questions at the beginning: whether high-tech technology widens the gap between rich and poor, and whether there's a practical way to combine technological progress with social justice. I told you 8 stories: the African groundnut scheme, the Great Leap Forward, the reinvention of the mobile home, the solar electric light project, the Mecca High School, the Grameen Bank, the resurgence of green technology, and the School for Blind Children. 3 of them are stories of failure: the groundnuts, the leap, and the homes. 3 are stories of success: the bank, the school at Mecca, and the school in Tibet. And 2 are still at too early a stage for us to pronounce them successes or failures. The 2 doubtful cases are solar electric light and green technology. Unfortunately, the stories do not give a clear answer to my questions. Only one of the successes, the Mecca High School, and none of the failures is a high-tech project. The 2 most important high-tech stories, solar electric light and green technology, are still in the doubtful category. Many more experiments need to be tried before we can answer the questions with a definite yes or no. Those of us who believe in science and in social justice still have lots of work to do to prove our case. But although the stories don't answer my questions, they do give us important lessons to keep in mind when we're planning new projects. The first lesson that emerges from the stories is the clear superiority of bottom-up projects to top-down projects. The three successes were all bottom-up, driven by local needs and implemented by local people. Most conspicuously successful, the Grameen Bank, is also the most conspicuously bottom-up. The Grameen Bank is a wonderful classic case of a single individual in a remote place far from centers of wealth and power, impelled by desperate needs of the people around him, creating an economic system that succeeded where national governments and international organizations had failed. The three failures were all top-down, driven by politicians and business leaders at the top of large bureaucracies remote from the problems that they were trying to solve. The most conspicuously unsuccessful, the Great Leap Forward, is the most conspicuously top-down. The Great Leap is a classic case of a single individual with dictatorial power over a great country, impelled by abstract notions of class struggle, creating an economic system that brought ruin and starvation to his people. So I conclude from these examples that a bottom-up strategy is one of the keys to success. Any project that aims at the relief of rural poverty should begin with detailed knowledge of the needs of the people it's trying to help. Another lesson these stories teach is the necessity of step-by-step experiments. Successful projects mostly grow from multiple small-scale experiments designed to find out what works well and what works badly. Spectacular failures result from big schemes launched without preliminary trials. Step-by-step experiments give us the best chance to avoid disastrous failures and find unexpected paths to success. The third lesson of my stories is the necessity of collaboration between diverse enterprises and diverse groups of people. No single enterprise can hope to solve a deep human problem such as rural poverty. If we're ever to solve this problem, it can only be by a working alliance of people who are experts in different areas. In the stories I told you, we saw three different approaches to the problem. First, the approach of Mecca High School and the school in Tibet, emphasizing high-quality local education as the key to progress. Second, the approach of Grameen Bank, emphasizing local economic initiatives. And third, the approach of Monsanto and other biotechnology companies, emphasizing science and high technology. All three approaches are needed, and they will be most effective if they are combined in a worldwide alliance. The force that should hold the alliance together and give it strength is ethics. The shared conviction of all parties that the gross inequities in the existing distribution of wealth around the world are ethically intolerable. So it's 8 o'clock and time for questions. Thank you.
Of the conceptions of technology that would be considered social technology. For example, there are two Nobel laureates in economics, one by the name of Gunnar Myrdal and another one by the name of Simon Kuznets, who both speak in terms of social technology. Or a sociologist by the name of Ogburn, who looked at the steam engine needing a concomitant of the factory system. The basic question, however, is that if you take this approach and you look at technology, which is essentially the application of knowledge, if you could make that applicable to social technology, this would be a way of ameliorating the tremendous cultural lags that we have in our cultures today, and would promote the advance of civilization in terms of the basic objective of social justice. So in other words, the basic question, without another speech, is, are you familiar with the concept of social technology, and would you, are you in favor of that?
The answer is yes, but I'm not expert. I've certainly read a little bit about it. But my question to you is, why aren't you out there doing it?
I would just like to answer that. I am very much in that realm of trying to promote systematic knowledge in the framework of institutional thought, which is the thinking of a John Kenneth Galbraith and a Gunnar Myrdal in the tradition of Thorstein Bunde Veblen, well known in institutional economics, but this is heterodox and very hard to sell in the conceptual framework of neoliberal economics, which dominates the world today in the free market ideology.
Yeah, in fact, I agree with all that. No, there was a part of my talk which I skipped. I didn't want to go on beyond the hour. But it's true, of course, that the free market ideology can be just as destructive as socialism. Dogmatic belief in either of them can be terribly dangerous, and we've got to escape from both of them.
Excuse me, I'd just like to add one other point, that we're having in the next round, I think November of next year, a very well-known Nobel laureate by the name of Joseph Stiglitz, who very much endorses what you're talking about and is antagonistic to the neoliberalism which dominates our culture today.
Well, thank you very much. Let's now give the questioners a chance.
I have a question. I'm way up in the balcony where you'll never see me. I was interested in your story about the Jason project under Carter and the housing attempts to improve housing and the reinvention of the mobile home. I was wondering to what extent the research at that point looked at the entrepreneurial experiments by Bucky Fuller, which I've been reading about for some years. His approach was to look at the aerospace sector. At that time, he was at Beach Aircraft in Kansas City in the 1940s and came up with the first prototype of a house built of metallic components that could be assembled on site, mostly factory built. A lot of people think of him as only exploring the dome, and we do have dome industry here in Oregon, but it's still mostly ordinary construction techniques, but they do a lot at the factory, and these homes can be integrated into ordinary neighborhoods. We have one near Fremont. Anyway, I was just wondering to what extent your research was outside the normal housing technology that we're used to and considered a whole different sector building houses, such as Boeing or these other aerospace companies taking a role in that.
Yes, well, no, we didn't look at that. I certainly, at least I didn't. Some of the other people in the group may have.
Thank you.
Thank you for suggesting it. So let's have some questions.
Okay. I guess this will have a little prologue, but engineers are typically people, when they're doing their best job, transforming technological ideas into things that ordinary workers can make. Where would you see, say, engineers or technologists maybe solving some of the big problems so that they can be implemented at the village level, perhaps new technologies that nonetheless a village or a small organization can implement?
Well, I'm not an expert in this field, of course, but I have a friend who is a young man called Martin Fisher, who is doing precisely that very successfully in Africa. He started an organization called APROTECH, standing for Appropriate Technology. And it operates in Kenya, but he's now, in fact, he's producing stuff which is sold all over Africa in many countries. And it is a non-profit foundation in which he's designing tools which are then produced locally by the Africans for profit and used by the African farmers also for profit. So it profits everybody except him. And it has been astoundingly successful. The way he operates is to look at what the farmers actually can do with the little bit of cash that they have. The average African farmer is a subsistence farmer, that's in East Africa at least, subsistence farmer who farms about half an acre of land. They just barely are able to grow enough vegetables to live on, cultivating the land by hand with a hoe, essentially without any other tools. So what does it take to convert a subsistence farmer living on the edge of starvation into somebody who's doing reasonably well? So my friend Martin Fisher studied this from the point of view of an engineer, and he came to the conclusion that the best product he could design would actually do the job. It is an irrigation pump worked by human power, you operate it with your feet, and it works in many of the terrain in East Africa. There's enough underground water to pump onto the land. And so a single individual, a mother of a family typically, can irrigate 2 acres of land. And it makes a huge difference to her life. And the price of this piece of equipment manufactured in Kenya is $46 American, which is just about enough for her to, it's low enough so she can afford to buy the irrigation pump. It's sold under the name of the moneymaker, and it is a moneymaker for hundreds of thousands of these subsistence farmers. So that's a remarkable example of what you can do with good design. It is the only thing different from this pump and other people's pumps is it is cheaper, it is more rugged, and it is more efficient. It has very high mechanical efficiency, which is essential if it's something that you have to work with your feet.
Dr.
In the
Dyson.
balcony, I was wondering what you thought the chances of success would be for our government, which is through high-tech means causing a regime change in Iraq and thus bringing about liberal democracy.
Well, I honestly don't want to get into that subject. I mean, I could talk about that, but I think you all of you have strong opinions, which almost everybody has strong opinions on this subject, and I don't think we'll get any further by arguing about it. So I think I'd rather let it pass in silence.
Dr. Dyson.
Yes.
If you could comment, please, on poverty and economic injustice in the first world, North America, Europe.
Yeah, well, it exists here, and it's just as difficult to cope with here as it is in Africa. I had a daughter who went to the Peace Corps and was supposed to be helping the Africans, and she came back and she said, you don't have to go to Africa to find people in need. So she's now working in Maine, dealing with very similar problems. And no, that is certainly true. I can't tell you anything firsthand about that. Clearly the problem of poverty in this country is in a way more subtle, because it is a problem of culture rather than a problem of actual shortages. We have all the stuff we need, it's just badly distributed. And so I don't have any great wisdom about that. Clearly we need to get away from the market economy to some extent. The market is wonderful for doing some things, but it's lousy for feeding the poor.
Dr. Dyson, your dream, as you say, to rebalance the gray-green continuum sounds ominously like Tanzania's groundnut dream, and seems to give some short shrift to the biological fact that nature bats last. I'm wondering what scientific or physical information you're looking at that leads you to conclude that we ought to go down the path full force of genetically modified organisms that will lead us to progress rather than destruction.
Well, we're already doing it to a great extent. And I mean, I don't claim this is a cure for all our ills. What I will tell you a little about this, I mean, I don't know anything firsthand about the effect that this revolution in agriculture is having. I listened to an interesting debate on the subject at the World Economic Forum in Davos, which was essentially a debate between the Europeans and the Africans. And the Europeans, of course, are 100% against genetically modified foods, and the Africans were 100% in favor. And I think that tells you something. The arguments the Europeans were using against the genetically modified foods, I felt were insincere. They were based largely on the fact that Europe has a very good climate and good soils for the conventional kinds of farming. Europeans don't need genetically modified foods, and they can get along very well with the old-fashioned farming. So by all means, let them do that. But the Africans do need it, and they resent very much the fact that the Europeans will not import genetically modified foods, which could make a big difference to Africa.
I was rather concerned at the end of your talk when you mentioned the fact that Monsanto is one of the ways to go forward.
Right. And I said that deliberately in order to provoke you.
It worked. In particular, talking about the bottom-up approaches instead of top-down, I'm reminded of the boycotts in India against Monsanto attempting to distribute either genetically modified or genetically sterile seed stocks, and then getting upset when the local farmers try to maintain some for the next year. In your metaphor, it's almost like what Monsanto is doing and other biotechnology companies are doing is graying the green technology by patenting even existing forms of rice and other grains, and essentially trying to establish a top-down legal approach to owning the crops that are being raised and used by the local farmers.
Yeah, well, I won't try to argue with you. I happen not to believe much of that. Some of it is true, but I think the way you put it is a gross exaggeration. But in any case, I think that being a profit-making company is not a disqualification from doing good in the world. And in fact, I think Monsanto is doing a lot of good. I happen to have friends in Monsanto, so I'm not an unbiased witness.
Right.
But I believe they are, in fact, doing a lot of good. They are, in fact, not compelling anybody to buy their seeds. The people who buy their seeds have a free choice. They can either buy their seeds or they can buy local producers. It's up to the customers to decide. And in many cases, the customers are doing well, and Monsanto is also doing well. And I consider that's the way it should be.
All right, thank you.
Hello, Dr. Dyson. I'm a composer and filmmaker, and the fundamentals of intellectual property have seemingly become more and more of a boundary to innovation and cultural creativity than a method of cooperation. My very general question is, what are your thoughts about open source technology and the open sourcing of intellectual property today?
Well, there again, I'm not an expert. I mean, my father was a composer, and I'm always amazed by the fact that he's been dead for 30 years, he makes more money from his compositions than I make from my books. So there's intellectual property rights seem to work better for musicians than they do for authors. I don't know why that is so. I suppose you get a performing rights payment every time your work is played, but you don't get a performing rights payment every time your book is read. So I don't know what we can do to remedy that.
But I guess just to add quickly, in regards to open source technology, even in regards to some scientists hoping that it can be applied to scientific studies, that the intellectual property could be then generated into the larger scientific communities easier and more readily.
Yes, well, I believe in open source software, And that's, I mean, that's of course now a going concern. It works very well, and there's lots of it around, and we hope it'll spread further. But that's not quite the same thing. I mean, that is only a very special area. And as far as the intellectual property rights in general are concerned, I don't think you can get away with owning everything in common. There has to be some kind of a compromise, and I don't know exactly where that should be. But I'm being asked questions only about things I don't know about, it seems.
I'm curious if you think, if there's any hope for USAID, Agency for International Development, as an institution of our government. Obviously, it's totally, very much top-down, but as we hope to spend some tiny part of our national budget internationally in a constructive fashion, is there any hope for that kind of organization, or is it constantly going to be a top-down, and we should look to spend our monies or our efforts for those who want to work in that field in an NGO or, you know, some private enterprise, hooking up with people like you mentioned, the women in Tibet, or individuals who are citizens of developing nations?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, I've never been to these countries that I've been talking about. I certainly don't know anything about USAID except what, I mean, my Peace Corps daughter had a very dim view of it, but that was quite a while ago, I guess almost 20 years ago. So I don't know whether they've improved in the meantime. I think it's obvious that you have to have collaborations between all these institutions. They should be able to learn from each other, but I can't tell you how.
Good evening. I have a question regarding green technologies and gray, the gray technologies that you were talking about. Do those develop efficiencies in terms of agricultural yield that, in essence, still give an advantage to the rich nations versus the poor nations, if it's the case that the green technologies are developed in the rich nations and you can get greater yields from smaller pieces of land? How can a poor nation, a rural subsistence farmer, ever compete with any product that is generated from a rich nation? Is it not the case that there's an emphasis on having these poor nations create products that somehow are going to compete with the products developed by the rich nations? The only thing they have is land, but nevertheless, how can they ever compete with the efficiencies that are developed by the rich nations?
Well, I would say that it will make a huge difference if we develop plants that have sort of combine the efficiency of photoelectric conversion of sunlight with the versatility of biological conversion. I mean, let me just talk numbers a bit. That's something I do know about, is numbers. There are two ways of harnessing solar energy. And I believe the future of the world really depends on this, to harness solar energy cheaply and efficiently. There are two ways of doing it. One is with photovoltaic conversion, which means you have a silicon sheet and you absorb the light in the silicon to make electricity. And that's something like 12% efficient. The other way is to grow a tree and convert sunlight into wood, or grow a crop plant and convert sunlight into food. And that's usually at most 1% efficient. That's a big gap of a factor of 10. And what I would say that we have a very good chance, if we're clever, and we are clever, I mean, biologists are generally clever people, we have a chance of combining these two things, making a crop plant which is somewhere close to 10% efficient rather than 1%, which, and of course it would apply not only to foods but to all kinds of chemical products. Anything you can synthesize biologically, you could hope to do it roughly 10 times as efficiently as the natural plants can do it. So it means you use only 1/10 of the land to produce the same output. So that's my hope. Whether it actually happens or not, of course, I don't know. But at least I think the possibility is very strong that this will happen. And when it happens, it will have an enormous equalizing effect, because it means you won't need such large areas of land to produce major quantities of either foods or other chemical products with solar energy. And in the end, that's where the wealth will be. Those countries that master this technology will become wealthy. And of course, the countryside won't only have farmers, as in Western Europe, where agriculture is highly mechanized and highly efficient. Most of the rural population is not farmers. They're mostly people who work in industry or in other areas, in universities and schools. They live in villages because they like to live in villages, not because they have to.
However, your response didn't deal with the poor rural subsistence farmer. How is he going to acquire this advanced technology? It's only going to have to come about either from the top down or through a rich nation somehow. It's still going to be expensive. If you can't afford a $46 pump, you're not going to be able to afford very advanced technology either way.
Well, this kind of technology need not be expensive. It's just, once you have developed the genetic understanding, once you have the seeds that are genetically modified in such a way as to do all these wonderful things, which hasn't yet happened. But once you have the seeds, then anybody can multiply them, and they don't have to be Monsanto Terminator seeds. They can be all kinds of seeds, so that the poor countries can develop them for themselves. It's not, and biotech is not expensive in the same way that other kinds of industry are. It's you can in fact do it cheaply, and there are many countries which are successful in farming without big resources and without great wealth.
But Dr. Dyson, won't the genome for that 10% efficient plant be patented by a corporation like, well, let's just take, for example, Monsanto?
That's possible. On the other hand, patents don't last for very long, and they expire, and also you can usually find ways around them by modifying what it is you're trying to do. So that's certainly not going to put a stop to the industry.
Dr. Dyson, this country itself started out pretty dirt poor, and would it not be far simpler to take the social and the governmental restraints off the people themselves, allow their freedom to create this revolution?
Well, nobody's stopping them from doing it today. It takes time, it takes dedicated people, but it's not the government that's standing in the way. At least not in most places. Yeah.
What are your views on using green technology like in environment scrubbing bacteria or genetically engineered plants and animals to change the ecology, and also using microbes as ore miners or resource harvesters?
Well, I think it's a great idea, and it remains to be seen really how well it will work. But I don't see any reason why it shouldn't. Certainly, it has the beauty that it can be done in many different ways in different places, so you can learn by your mistakes how to do it better. So I think it has a great future. And I can imagine, especially mining, it's not so much, it's not bacteria so much, but little bugs, little worms, you can imagine burrowing into the ground and bringing up the ores. And it could be much less destructive than the kind of mining we do now with destroying the land with strip mines. So anyway, I hope it'll all come in time.
Doctor, my name is Woo Kyung Kim, and I'm a high school student at Sunset High School. My question is this. Would the government of a certain more wealthier and more powerful countries, why would they devote their resources on helping the poor and therefore reducing their relative share of the world wealth? And the second question is, I make this quick, I promise. Second question is, what is your response to certain conservative groups and certain religious groups who oppose a genetic engineering in any forms, such as the current administration seems to be?
No, it's not true that the current administration opposes genetic engineering of plants. They oppose genetic engineering of humans, which is a very different concern. And genetic engineering of humans, I think, also has a great future, but it certainly is much more problematical, and there are justifiable religious feelings about that. I don't know, I think the opponents of genetic engineering of plants are not so much opposing it on religious grounds, but much more on aesthetic grounds, or grounds of the idea that nature knows best, which in many cases, of course, is true. Not always.
What about my first question, Doctor?
Oh, I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, that's a political question, and I don't know any more about that than you do.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yes?
If you look back into American history, when people were coming over from Europe, and likewise when they're moving west, the colonization, the people that colonized new areas, they really had to start from scratch and build up everything. And now you look at, the West Coast, and it's not a poor place. But do you see examples such as these as just luck, or do you think that that could happen in other countries?
Oh, it does happen in other countries, of course. One thing you must remember is this country had high tariffs all through the time when it was growing. It was not a free trade company at that. It was not a free trade country at that time. There was a very heavy protection of the native industries, and that's what the rest of the world very much needs today. I would say that the total free trade is usually not advantageous to the countries which are just developing, and we should allow the developing countries to protect their own industries much more than we do.
Dr. Dyson? Up here.
Okay, 3 more. Yes.
Up here. My objection to the green revolution, as you're talking about, is not political or ethical, but scientific, which is that any biologist will tell you that a healthy environment is one that has a lot of diversity, and that genetic engineering tends to swamp the natural genome. So how do you foresee that, averting this problem of getting lack of diversity?
Well, that's of course up to us. When the tools exist, we can decide how to use them. I would think that there's a good chance that the biotech will go the same way that computer technology has gone, that it'll end up in the hands of kids. It will be, you take home your grow-a-pet kit and design a new kind of rose or a new kind of cat, So I would say on the long run it'll produce much greater diversity. That could have its dangers too. But I think we're more likely, as a result of this technology, to see an increase of diversity rather than a decrease. Of course, I could be wrong about that.
So far, we've seen a decrease in diversity.
Sometimes. I don't know. I mean, biologists I talk to, I don't think would necessarily agree with that. But I don't know if anybody's done a careful count.
Dr. Dyson.
Yes.
I'm very endeared by your ideas. I'm over here. Yo. Because I'm a sci-fi buff. But I also teach intercultural communication, and so I'm stuck on this idea of culture. It seems that many of your ideas have the assumption that technology is a good thing for all people, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how do you resolve the differences between cultural values regarding technology?
Yes, I don't know. What strikes me is that you take one culture which is as alien to us as any is the Japanese culture, and yet they've taken to technology like ducks to water. In fact, in many ways they're better at it than we are. And it seems that it's very hard to find a culture which doesn't allow technology to grow, some better than others, but certainly there's a large variety of cultures which has adapted very well to technology. So we shall see. But certainly I think one thing the Japanese did, which made a huge difference when they decided to modernize, it was a conscious decision of the Japanese government when they restored the Emperor Meiji in 1870-something, whenever it was. They made the conscious decision to translate the whole scientific literature of the world into Japanese. They hired large numbers of translators so that every Japanese schoolchild from that time on learned science in his own language or her own language. I think that was extremely important. And countries which have done that, of course, have a much easier time. Unfortunately, there are many countries which have not. So in large parts of the world today, children have to learn a foreign language before they can learn technology. And of course, that sets them back.
Dr. Dyson, I was wondering if you could elaborate on your views on the vision of the hydrogen economy and how long you think it'll take before that might be implemented.
I don't think it'll ever be implemented, but of course, I mean, I don't have any worked out views about this. I've never looked at it carefully, but it looks to me unlikely because I think we shall come to terms with the carbon dioxide quite easily. I mean, I think the problem of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be handled with with appropriate land management, and that's one reason why I like the genetic engineering. When you have plants that are 10 times as efficient as existing plants, they are sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere 10 times as fast as our existing plants. So it means this whole problem of carbon in the atmosphere will probably fade out over the next 50 or 100 years. So I don't think we'll need a hydrogen economy, and I don't see any particular advantage. And the only advantage I can see is that if you worry about carbon in the atmosphere, I think there are other ways of dealing that which are probably more practical. So I can be wrong, of course, but I've frequently been wrong. But I find the hydrogen economy looks to me difficult just because it's such awkward stuff to handle. I can't imagine carrying around hydrogen the way we carry around alcohol and gasoline and the existing liquid fuels. They're in many ways so much more convenient. So I won't be around anyway to be proved wrong.
Excuse me, I'd like to ask one last question, if I may. This is on solar power satellites. I don't think anybody else has brought this subject up. I'm an inventor. I've invented a new kind of a solar power satellite. I know Peter Glaser did that, and I'm an Apollo engineer, scientist, mathematician, and one of the things I came across in the Apollo project was a mathematical study which showed that we can fabricate optics in space very large, very accurately, and very inexpensively. I've shown that we can have optics which are very accurate, which can convey solar energy to the ground. We can have 10 terawatts of energy on the ground, which is the total amount of energy used by the world for everything, both a 500-mile diameter satellite, which would be 1% efficient. I've shown how to do this. You need accuracy 1/4000th the diameter of a human hair, and this can be achieved in the technology of liquid space optics, which I'm the inventor of. Anyway, I'd like to talk to you about this at great length, perhaps, or some length. In detail, it does appear that solar power satellites, in other words, instead of just having the ground up or the top down, bottom up or top down, you can have both top down and bottom up, and this would be the way of bringing it top down. Now, Peter Glaser showed that, the Department of Energy showed that Peter Glaser satellites would not be cost effective for 35 years. I have a new technology which I believe shows that they can be effective right away. Anyway, it's very technical. It's a calculus of variations, and I want to talk to you about it. I read your articles on space colonies. Very interesting.
So I think the audience has spoken. So let's declare the session closed. I'll be happy to talk with you privately, or you can send me an email, whatever you like. I'd like to see the details of that, but this is not the time to talk about it in this group. Thank you very much.